Imagine this. Your DNA. It might hold these echoes of really dramatic historical events, things that happened centuries ago that you probably never even thought about.
Exactly. And today we're diving into some fascinating research from Spain.
Yeah, using ancient DNA to look at the genetic impact of ethnic cleansing. It sounds intense.
It is. We're focusing on Eastern Iberia, so roughly modern-day Valencia. We want to see how the gene pool there was shaped by history,
Right.
by North African populations starting way back in Roman times through the Islamic period, and then leading up to this huge event, the expulsion of the Moriscos.
Okay, so this is all based on a new study.
Yeah, researchers at the University of Huddersfield and their partners published in Genome Biology. They looked at ancient DNA from people living there over like 1,000 years. Really comprehensive stuff.
Wow. So our mission here, for you listening, is to kind of unpack how these big shifts, Roman Empire, Islamic conquest, the Reconquista, that expulsion, how they literally left a mark on people's genes.
And we'll find some surprising connections, maybe challenge a few assumptions along the way.
Okay, let's start way back. Early Mediterranean influences. It seems like there was gene flow into Iberia before the Islamic conquest, like during Roman times.
That's right. It wasn't like Iberia was completely isolated. The Roman Empire seems to have created this broader Mediterranean mixing pot, you could say.
And there's specific evidence?
Yes, the study points to a Roman-era woman from Valencia. She lived, let's see, around 249 to 408 CE.
Okay.
And her DNA, it shows links to Central and Eastern Mediterranean populations. So a mix of local Iberian, maybe Italian, Sardinian, but also potentially some Eastern Mediterranean ancestry in there too.
Okay, that's interesting layering already.
Yeah.
Wasn't there something else, something really unusual about her?
Ah, yes. You're thinking of the mitochondrial DNA.
Hmm.
She had this haplogroup, D4E1, which is really rare and typically East Asian.
East Asian in
Yeah.
Roman Spain. How does that work?
Well, it's important to remember her overall genetic makeup was definitely West Eurasian. But this specific maternal line, D4E1, it's intriguing.
Yeah. It pops up in places linked to steppe migrations, like the Xiongnu Empire, even Roman-era Turkey. So it could be a faint echo of movements involving groups like Huns, Alans, Sarmatians, maybe.
Wow, okay. A tiny genetic clue to vast ancient movements.
Exactly. It shows how connected things were, even back then.
So even before the Islamic period really kicked off, we see some Mediterranean mixing and maybe hints of North African ancestry already present. It's just like sporadically.
Yeah, the study found traces of North African ancestry from the 4th to 8th centuries, so pre-Islamic conquest. But it was at lower levels, not like what came later. It sets the stage, though.
Okay, so that brings us to the Islamic period itself, starting around 711 CE. And the researchers talk about Berberization. What does that actually mean here?
Right, Berberization. So the Islamic conquest brought a more sustained, consolidated North African genetic presence into Eastern Iberia.
And the analysis identified this cluster of medieval individuals from Islamic burials who grouped together genetically. They represent this population that emerged during Al-Andalus with a clear, significant North African component. That's the Berberized population.
And how significant are we talking, like, kind of percentages?
In that main cluster, it's around 14 to 18% North African-related ancestry.
Okay, 14, 18%.
But get this, one of the earliest Islamic burials they dated, maybe 706 to 888 CE. That individual had much higher levels, around 31.3%.
31%. Wow, that's quite high for an early period. What could that mean?
Well, it might represent, someone from the early phases of interaction and mixing, maybe early acculturation.
And did they look deeper into where that North African ancestry might have come from?
They did. The modeling suggested something really interesting. About half seemed related to a source like the ancient Guanches of the Canary Islands, and the other half from a southern European source. It paints a really complex picture of who was moving where.
Definitely. Were there other genetic markers pointing to North Africa, like specific lineages?
Yes, absolutely. For instance, one Islamic individual had the mitochondrial haplogroup L3D1.
Which is African, right?
Typically African, yes. And that was found alongside other West Eurasian mitochondrial lines, plus Y chromosome haplogroups that likely point to the Levant or North Africa. So, multiple lines of evidence.
And you mentioned earlier, sometimes this movement wasn't voluntary.
Unfortunately, yes. The genetic data also seems to reflect the medieval slave trade from North Africa. The presence of certain African lineages likely points to people being brought into Iberia through enslavement. It's a darker side to that connection.
Right, that's sobering. Something else that caught my eye was about inbreeding. increasing over time.
Yeah, that was another finding. They looked at runs of homozygosity, basically, long stretches of identical DNA you inherit from both parents.
Okay. And finding more of those suggests.
It can suggest increased relatedness between parents or inbreeding within a population group. They saw signs of this increasing in the medieval Valencian population over time.
Why might that happen?
The hypothesis is that it could be linked to social isolation, particularly within the Mudejar communities, Muslims living under Christian rule, and later the Moriscos. Their social and marriage networks might have become more restricted.
Right, keeping within their own group.
Potentially. And interestingly, even that very early Islamic burial, the one with the high North African ancestry, also showed signs of consanguinity.
Okay, so we have this established population with significant North African ancestry during the Islamic period. Then comes the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest. You'd expect a big genetic shift, right? New rulers, maybe new people moving in.
You absolutely would expect that. But here's one of the most surprising findings of the study.
Okay.
There was little to no detectable effect of the Reconquista on the overall genetic ancestry profile of the medieval Valencian population they sampled.
Wait, really? So people buried in Christian cemeteries after the Reconquista?
Exactly. Individuals from 14th, 15th century Christian cemeteries, genetically, they still clustered right alongside the earlier Islamic population. They had similar levels of that North African ancestry.
That's fascinating. So who were these people? They're in Christian cemeteries, but genetically they look like the previous population.
The researchers suggest they could well be Moriscos.
Ah, the forcibly converted Muslims.
Precisely. It points to this amazing genetic continuity, even though the religious and political landscape had completely changed. Maybe conversion didn't immediately erase those deeper ancestral ties or community structures.
So the genes tell a story of continuity where maybe the historical narrative focuses more on the rupture of the Reconquista.
In this specific population, yes, at least until the next major event.
Right. Which brings us to the really dramatic part, the Morisco expulsion. This is later 17th century.
Correct. Early 17th century, now we're in the post-medieval period, 16th, 17th centuries. And the study looked at two individuals from a Christian cemetery from this time. Their stories are quite different.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, one individual was found with an iron shackle.
Oh, wow. Sign of enslavement.
Almost certainly. And genetically. This person clusters very tightly with modern North Africans, specifically Moroccan and Algerian Berbers.
So likely an enslaved North African person living after the Reconquista, but before the main Morisco expulsion.
That's the strong implication, yes. A
Yep.
really poignant find.
Definitely makes it real. And the other person from that same cemetery, same time period.
This is the crucial one. The other 17th century individual was the only person in the entire 1,000-year data set who had no detectable North African-related ancestry. Zero.
Whoa. The only one out of everyone they tested across centuries.
The only one. A complete break from the pattern we saw persisting even after the Reconquista.
And this lines up directly with the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609.
Exactly. In 1609, this massive ethnic cleansing happens. Around 300,000 people, maybe a third of Valencia's population at the time, expelled primarily to North Africa.
A third of the population just removed.
Yes. And what this genetic data seems to show is the direct consequence, that long-standing genetic link between this part of Europe and North Africa, effectively severed, wiped clean in this region.
And the region was repopulated.
Presumably repopulated by people from other parts of Spain, maybe more northern areas who just didn't have that same level of North African ancestry. So the genetic landscape was fundamentally altered.
It's incredible how clearly a single historical event is reflected in the DNA like that. Just boom, a total shift.
It really is a stark genetic signature of ethnic cleansing.
But wait, there was one more twist, wasn't there? Something about South America.
Ah, yes, the South American connection. This is another really interesting layer. The study discusses the known presence of North African ancestry in many present-day South American populations.
Which seems odd at first glance. How would that happen?
Well, the theory put forward, supported by this study's findings, relates to when people left Spain for the Americas.
Okay.
Think about it. Colonization starts before the 1609 expulsion. So the colonists leaving Spain in the 15th, 16th, early 17th centuries would have come from a Spain where North African ancestry was still pretty common, especially perhaps in the south.
Ah, particularly from those southern port cities like Seville and Cadiz, where the ships left from.
Exactly. Those cities would have been hubs with diverse populations, likely including people carrying this North African genetic heritage, even if they were generations removed from the initial mixing or were converts.
So the Valencian samples, showing that high North African ancestry persisted until the expulsion, kind of support the idea that similar populations existed elsewhere in Spain at the time people were leaving for the Americas.
Precisely. It makes the presence of North African DNA in South Americans much less mysterious. It was likely carried over by some of the early Spanish colonists themselves, reflecting the genetic reality of Spain at that time.
Even if official policy tried to restrict converts or new Christians from emigrating.
Right, policies existed, but reality on the ground and clandestine movement could be different. Plus, just the general background level of this ancestry in the colonizing population would have been higher before 1609.
That ties it all together in a really unexpected way. So summing this all up, what's the big picture takeaway?
I think the clearest message is just how powerfully a major historical event like the Morisco expulsion can reshape the genetic landscape of a region. It's direct evidence written in DNA of ethnic cleansing leaving a lasting scar.
Yeah.
But it also shows a more complex story before that, more mixing during Roman times than maybe we thought, and this incredible persistence of North African ancestry through the Reconquista surviving for centuries.
And those surprising points, the lack of genetic impact from the Reconquista itself, the persistence until 1609, and then that link to South America.
Yeah, those really stand out. They challenge any simple narrative of constant conflict and replacement. It was
Right.
much more intertwined, genetically speaking, for a very long time.
It really does make you think about your own ancestry, doesn't it? Like what subtle traces of migrations or big historical events might be hiding in your own DNA. This shows the past isn't really past. It's literally carried inside us.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. This study focused on one region, one dramatic event. But think about the scale of the Morisco expulsion's impact here. What other historical events, maybe less documented or in different parts of the world, might have left similar huge genetic footprints that we just haven't uncovered yet?
What other stories are our genes waiting to tell?
Exactly. There's likely so much more hidden history waiting to be revealed through studies like this.